Okay, today I'd like to start discussion about whether we can trust science and to what degree we can do that, because what happens is that, let's say people get indoctrinated in a religion and then they grow out of it and they start believing science instead of religion, and that's a step up. But unfortunately, the more I investigate how science is being made and all of that all the details about like what we know and how we came to know what we know, and the big institutions, international institutions, regulators that tell us the ultimate truth based on research, I see a lot of disturbing things. So for example, right now most research in the US is sponsored by the industry, and I'm talking specifically about research in nutrition and about the research in psychology and about the research in pharmaceutical type of realm. So there's a lot of money, and there are companies that have a lot of power who want to buy some sort of proof, scientific proof, that their products either work or that they're not dangerous, and they finance research, and that's the step number one. And then there is also political pressure sometimes to maybe come to conclusions a little bit faster than possible scientifically. And then there are big egos of scientists that also want to get published and want to be recognized for their findings, so they will better find something that's very meaningful. And to do that, they might manipulate with the data, they might do the same research many times until they get it to the result that they want. And there's the whole scheme of financing of grants, and that if the scientist is not producing some incredible results and getting published, he will not receive more grants, for example. So there are so many different ways that there are pressures on studies. And then after the study gets published, then the media takes it and it's blowing it out of proportions. It's, saying something completely out of context just to have a clickbait headline. So all this process is really messed up, I think, in general. What do you think?
Well, so generally, I think that science is good. And science, the scientific approach, so what we define as science, if I define it as having a hypothesis, taking evidence, doing experiments, not having any pre-made opinion on it, just taking the data as it comes in, and then analyzing the data without any opinion on it and without any bias, and then finding result. I think that's good. Now, what you're saying is, what I see is that it's not science is bad. It's that there's some reasons why currently we don't get real scientific results, because there are people for different reasons, especially the people that have an interest in the scientific results, and that's why the result is not necessarily an objective result, but it's a result that might not be really true.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great point, that the scientific method is great, but the conditions are rarely perfect, and there are so many incentives to get it wrong. And then there's also the chance. So, for example, there's this whole thing about p-values and how much we can trust the results of the particular study and the data. What's the confidence interval in the results? So, by chance, let's say we flip the coin 100 times. It can happen that 90 times out of 100 that we flipped it, it will be heads or it will be tails, just by chance, right? So there is a chance that one study has certain findings just by chance. So then there's a lot of room to manipulate that and all of that. But yeah, another thing I wanted to say.
Let me just add to this one. So I guess what we need to understand is that from 10,000 scientific studies, maybe 1 or maybe 10 get published and 1 gets a lot of attention. Now, this one study is a study out of 10,000. So when you're saying I'm flipping a coin 100 times and I'm getting an unlikely result, which is 90 times it comes up as head instead of tail, then I would say, well, if you do this once, then it's unlikely. But if you do it 10,000 times, it's probably quite likely that once you get this result. So, and that's the one that's going to be published, and that's the one that gets all the attention.
Yes.
So there's a selection bias.
Yeah, there are a lot of biases, and another big part of it is that science cannot answer certain questions that we would like science to answer. For example, when it comes to diets, we are not able to do a randomized control study that would determine causation. So we cannot take 1,000 people and tell 500 of them now stick to the ketogenic diet for 100 years and the other ones to vegan diet or whatever, because it's all based on self-reported data. They give you this questionnaire. So what did you eat in the last 6 months and in what quantities? And there's like 300 items. And yeah, that's going to be amazing. Like people don't remember what they ate during the last 24 hours. And so we don't have reliable tools to even measure certain things, but we expect science to deliver us answers. So the science is delivering like some association. We think it's causation. Two things happen at the same time. We think one is causing the other, which is not true. When I was taking some psychology courses, in every course, they were showing us how to critique scientific research. They were saying, like, be super skeptical of scientific studies. Look how big was the sample size. Look what was happening. Was there a control group? What did they do exactly? What does it really prove? Was it only on young men in the US? It doesn't mean that it applies also to 65-year-old women in India. Like there are so many considerations that make those studies quite limited. Even if they're truly well done, they are not showing us the ultimate truth about the world.
Okay, sure. So you're saying that there are some reasons to be skeptical about scientific studies, right?
Exactly. And
okay.
I think we're not.
Yeah, what I'm observing is a little bit the opposite, which is, yeah, it's true that there are scientific studies that are biased because scientists want to publish. Scientists want to get funding. In order to get funding, they need to publish. It's all about publishing. If they publish something that is not correct, then they don't get a harsh punishment. If they don't publish, then the funding will dry up. Also, there is industry lobby, and industry lobby financing a lot of the research. And of course, you would expect the research to go the way that's good for the industry, be it in the area of telecommunication, be it in the area of drugs, be it in the area of nutrition. However, what I also see is that there is more and more skepticism about science. And I would say unjustified skepticism. Not only talking about religion, that religious people are doubting that evolution happened, but I'm also talking about people that are doubting that the climate change is real, or that nowadays are doubting a lot of medical evidence because they read something, a minor opinion on the internet, and they believe by just reading social media and reading some opinions from opinion leaders that that's the truth. So they weigh opinion leaders that might not have any medical training the same way as they would value the opinion by a scientist or a doctor. So there are different reasons, I think, while we actually have an increase in mistrust towards science. So I would say that these both things.
That's a good point, and I think eventually, like, the picture is much more messy than we would want it. Like there is a lot of bad science. Like for example, people were trying to replicate the most famous psychology studies, and like 70% of them were not reproducible or something like that. And then the cancer studies, 50-something studies were tried to be replicated, and then like 46 of them were not reproducible as well. So like the basis of what we know are so easily, shaken. And then the big organizations claim something, and once they fix their minds on that, even if there is a lot of evidence coming against this, they want to stick with the previous opinion to save their image or whatever. Like in case of, I don't know, saturated fat, putting fluoride into people's water, lots of different things where, you know, the science got it wrong. It wasn't a good science to begin with. And then the institutions were, okay, this is the policy, this is the thing. And now it's really hard to challenge it because there's a whole host of mechanisms to protect the status quo. That's called scientific consensus. But sometimes it's based on a very shaky material to begin with. So I think what you're saying is true. Like, there is a danger from crazy people saying crazy things, I don't know, flat earth movement and so on. But in the same time, we need to realize the limitations and the falsehoods of science as well. So we need to be extra vigilant in both ways.
Okay. So let's collect some examples of cases where you feel science needs to be taken with a little bit of doubt, with a little bit of mistrust.
Well, it's very interesting to watch what different industries were doing in terms of sponsoring research, because now it's like, oh, we don't know what's happening because there's a lot of conflicting studies. For example, do sugar drinks cause type 2 diabetes and obesity? Well, 100% of research sponsored by Coca-Cola shows that they don't. And that's like a lot of studies, well-designed studies, whatever. And then we have some independent studies that show that obviously they do. And the problem is that with so much money, the industry can create, 10 studies for each independent study, and then it can create a false consensus. So that's one example. A lot of I was just reading a study right now that was analyzing.
Okay, so you're saying basically in nutrition, there are generally, I would say, if you talk about unprocessed foods, there's not so much money to be made by any individual company with unprocessed foods. One, because they are quite cheap. Let's say vegetables are quite cheap. And second, because there's so many farmers that produce them, and there's no really gain from anybody having them unprocessed. So that means that there is not much to be gained by having more people believe that raw, unprocessed foods are healthy. So that's why there is not a lot of, I would say, if a study says unprocessed food is good for you, I would probably trust it. There's no reason, because there's really no lobby that would say that it's that this needs to be the case. However, for sugar industry, and there's an association in the US, I think that's quite strong, which is the Sugar Manufacturer Association. I think Coca-Cola is part of it. That would probably be quite a big lobby, because they're making a lot of money. And so they don't want people to think that a Snickers, a Mars, or a Coca-Cola is too unhealthy.
Exactly. And they put some money into bribing scientists at Harvard back in the day into shifting the blame from sugar to fat at some point. There was like, I think, Wall Street Journal article about this at some point as well. There was a lot of shady stuff going on. We could watch also the tobacco industry back in the day, when there was, growing concern that tobacco might be causing cancer. And then they are like, well, it can be proven because no one can do like a controlled trial. And, they were trying to put a lot of studies to like delude the consensus, and they were doing a lot of different things. And then sugar industry is implementing very similar tactics. It's just like the whole science is mostly the US, right? That's where the science gets produced. And then it's mostly sponsored by the industry. So how can we trust it? So in this situation, maybe it's better to look at traditions of different cultures, regions, how they were doing for thousands of years, what they were eating, for example, because clearly Coca-Cola wasn't influencing that, 200 years ago. So maybe people knew how to eat better if they didn't have those chronic diseases we have now.
Are there any other examples besides sugar drinks?
Yeah, I mean, in psychology, for example, one of the good ones is that there was this lady who did research on power posing, right? She wrote a book and like, oh, you should stand up and like this, and it will, lower cortisol and increase, I don't know.
Amy, I think her name is Amy Cudler.
Yeah, it might be. Then you go to Wikipedia, and now power posing in Wikipedia is like, oh, this is like known to be false, pseudoscience, unreproducible. And it's just one of like so many examples. Now in Silicon Valley, this very famous startup with the analyzing blood of this lady as well. right? It was
Theranos.
valued at
Elizabeth Holmes from Theranos.
$1 billion of valuation based on complete falsehood. And this is just like little examples, right?
$4 billion.
4 billion, like over it was. I know it was in billions. So it's like wow. And do you know more examples?
Yeah, I think that I know some more examples. So the egg manufacturers made a lot of studies that eggs are not so bad for health, even though I would say it's scientifically proven that they are extremely bad for your health. And a lot of pretty much all the studies, just like in the case of Coca-Cola, all the studies that say eggs are actually not so bad for your health are sponsored by the industry. So I think in nutrition we can find a lot of the studies are, as you say, sponsored by the industry. I would say the same thing would be true with drugs. The drug manufacturers, they have an interest that we consume more drugs. So they would, if you look at psychiatry, they would want to define more and more diseases, more and more, I would say, natural human behavior, because we're all made different. The industry would define a lot of those behavior variations as a disease. And now we have, I would say, literally more than 1,000 psychological diseases. And now more and more people go to the psychiatrist or psychologist, they get diagnosed with a disease, and then they need a medication. So I myself know several people that I knew are sometimes happy, sometimes sad, which is totally normal. Now these people have gone to the psychiatrist and they were diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And they now say, oh, I am sometimes happy, I'm sometimes sad, so I have a bipolar disorder. I need to take my medication every single day for my whole life, making on the individual level thousands, on population level billions for the drug companies. So the drug companies are, they have an incentive to skew scientific results.
It reminds me of statins, how the whole market of statins was created when they set a level of like optimal cholesterol level, right? So they checked levels for like, I don't know, 200 people or something. And then they took an average of that. And then they said that this is already too much so that they can sell more statins. So like, it's better to be like below that. And from one day to the next, they created like billions of dollars worth of statin market. And then statins had a lot of like side effects on top of that. So it's very interesting. And then there are studies obviously that show that there is no correlation between cholesterol levels and heart disease, or that there's no correlation between eating cholesterol and having high levels of cholesterol. And then within cholesterol, there's like good or bad. And within the bad, there's also like big particles that are okay and the small particles that are bad. And that's like, it's so complicated. Whatever you research deeply, really deeply, then you see how messy it is and how little we really know and how much different interest and political influence there was, and big egos of big scientists were making decisions without having enough information. Yeah, it's
exactly
scary. So, wow.
I would say another area where we see a lot of scientific studies sponsored by the industry, and where the result of these studies that are sponsored by the industry are very different from the results that the scientific studies come that are independent, not sponsored by the industry, is the area of telecommunication, and especially the danger of mobile communication waves. So, for example, I would say there is very clear evidence, if you look at the independent studies not sponsored by industry, that mobile radiation causes cancer. Now, of course, it depends on the amount, on the exposure, but yes, there is a strong, very strong correlation. I would say also causation that can be proven for mobile frequencies being close to humans and that causing cancer. However, in pretty much all the industry-funded studies, you will not find that. And nowadays, we have the discussion about 5G, that they want to implement the 5G standard in most Western world, and there are a lot of people that are warning against that, and a lot of independent studies are warning against that, saying this would be huge dangers for health, but people are just ignoring it. And I do want to give some evidence. I have a friend of mine who was also kind of concerned about these mobile radiation and also other kinds of radiation in our environment. So she went to a very, very well-known doctor in Washington, D.C. And the doctor, her friend, said, okay, yeah, I'm also kind of concerned. And then they kind of, when they were sitting together, they said, well, I have in this hospital, we have this device that can measure radiation, and so we can just try it out. So they placed this device next to the mobile phone. They didn't see much of a radiation. But while the mobile phone was making a call, was connecting to a call, they saw a radiation level that was 3 times as high as the radiation level for which, according to US regulation, you need Faraday gloves. You need gloves that protect you from the radiation in order to touch anything that has such a high level of radiation. And people saw this in a normal iPhone. So they saw this in a normal iPhone. Then they did the same thing for a microwave. They went into the microwave, and they saw, again, an enormous amount of radiation that would be considered very unhealthy. So, and of course, in some countries, in socialist countries, in the Soviet Union, they did these studies. They probably didn't have many manufacturers, and they were in the Soviet Union, so there was not so much capitalist interest. And they banned the microwave, saying that this is unhealthy. The radiation is far too dangerous. And a lot of people would still say the same. And a lot of independent studies that are not sponsored by industry would say the same. Now, there were some studies that came out. A scientist, I don't know his name, he came out and said, "Look, that's very bad. Microwaves, you should never. It should be banned. It's very bad." But of course, the industry then went after that scientist, and then they sued him, and of course he had to defend him, and it's very expensive. So the industry, with all the money, was able to kind of quiet this voice down.
Yes, that's exactly the pattern in so many different industries, because now big corporations became global and became more powerful than countries. So, for example, you would think that, okay, the National Association of Dietitians must be as pure as it gets, right? It will protect you against this industry because it's like, I don't know, either, it's just the dietitians themselves, or is it the state that's helped? It's perfect. And then you look at the sponsors of dietary and dietitians associations in everywhere, US, UK, Poland, wherever. And you see Coca-Cola, Kraft, McDonald's. Those are the sponsors of the Dietary Association. So it's like, I have no words. And wherever you look really deeply, that's exactly what you find. That's exactly what you find. Then you have like mercury fillings in the teeth, right? Yeah, there are a lot of studies showing that you are being poisoned by that, because in your mouth you will have something hot, you will have a lot of scrubbing, right? You will have a lot of friction, and it will release just a little bit of mercury every single time. And when they were doing those experiments, but obviously it's safe. And like the next thing was like fluoride, which is a fascinating story, because fluoride is a toxic industrial waste. If you have an aluminum plant, then the waste product is fluoride, and normally they would have to pay to dispose of it safely because it's radioactive and so on. But in the US, not in Europe, they added to water supply for people under a false pretext that it prevents cavities, which it doesn't. Like, there is no legitimate science proving that at all. So
in Europe as well, I think in Switzerland as well.
Very few countries. I think a little bit in Ireland in some places, but all of Europe doesn't do it now.
Okay.
And there are some exceptions in the US that also don't do it, because it's more like community decides for themselves. But yeah, in Europe, We mostly don't use that. And we don't have different rates of cavities than in the US, which is one of the arguments why it's nonsense, basically.
Okay. So I would say the drug industry, with psychiatry. I would say the telecommunication industry, trying to make the danger of mobile radiation seem much less than it really is. I would say the food industry, trying to promote their processed food and coming out with health studies and influencing scientists by sponsoring certain research that goes in a certain direction, saying that certain products like processed foods, sugary foods, meat products are healthy, which a lot of independent studies would say they are not. Before we had the tobacco industry doing the same, saying that tobacco was great for your health,
Yes.
while we know nowadays that it's very dangerous and not very good for your health. Maybe nowadays, I'm not sure. I would say that marijuana, the weed industry, comes up with a lot of studies where weed has health benefits, and I would say, in my own opinion, weed is probably, as I would see it, maybe as not so bad anymore because now it's being legalized. So why is it so bad? I think there are a lot of negative things to weed. I would say that the same thing would be for coffee. I think that the coffee industry is very powerful, and they sponsor a lot of research. I think my own experience from what I would have read and my experience is that coffee is not good. It's a drug, and you don't want to be dependent on a drug. And there are many negative side effects to drinking coffee.
Yes, and generally we feel that we're protected by the government, and we're not. So, for example, alcohol is one of the worst drugs. Like the UK did this study of like putting all the drugs in order of how harmful they are, and like alcohol was number one, and marijuana was somewhere in the bottom. But this was like real science about that. And obviously, there's cultural reasons, and there's political reasons, and there's this and there's that. And we still have alcohol that's legal, and a lot of other things like psychedelics that are illegal, not legal. And then another industry that comes to mind is cosmetics industry. You know, there's like no regulation about toxicity of the cosmetics. Like you can come up with a new cosmetic, and the process of approval is laughable. There's just like, unless there's known poison in it, you will just get it approved easily. And then people use it on their skin, and who knows what will be the results of 40 years of putting all of these chemicals. A lot of them are, harmful in one way or the other. And we had this huge thing with asbestos. DTD, I think, was another name of the substance that was highly toxic. And yeah, and it takes a long time for independent researchers to find out how bad it is, and then the industry fights them for like 50 years, using a lot of money to do everything they can to discredit those people. And then finally, after the evidence is way too clear, then maybe public opinion also changes on that, right?
Okay, yeah, I agree. So let's summarize. Let's say the scientific method is good. Science is good. However, we can mistrust science because, on the one hand, there are certain inherent things with science that people need to get funding. People need to get published. They want to get published. In order to get published, they're trying to make some incredible results, which many times are so incredible that they're actually not true, but they can have ways to put biases in the data and screw the results. And then maybe most importantly, we have the industry, and the industry has an interest in the results of the scientists, and the scientist that is doing the research that is sponsored by the industry knows if he gets results that would be damaging for the industry, he will no longer be sponsored by the industry. So, but if he gets results that are good for the industry, then the industry will continue to fund him. So he has an incentive, maybe not explicit, but implicit. He knows this incentive that if he gets a good result for the industry, then the industry will continue to fund him. So he will look for results, not always, but sometimes. He'll be more prone to publish results that are not damaging for the industry. And there are several industries we looked at. So one industry is telecommunication. Telecommunication companies sponsoring research into the dangers of mobile radiation. This industry-sponsored research not finding much evidence. We looked at tobacco. We looked at alcohol. We looked at the food process, the food industry. They're sponsoring a lot of research. Even these companies like Coca-Cola, Kraft, that are producing processed food, sugary food that is not good for us, sponsoring research that many times disproves the theories that their food is not good for us. But of course, they have a clear interest in these scientific findings. So for these reasons, a lot of science is sponsored by the industry. We need to be careful with the scientific findings.
Yes, and many times what they use is they shift the attention. For example, when Michelle Obama tried to solve obesity epidemic, she wanted to obviously change the food, but the industry was like, no, no, no. So then the allowed version was to focus on exercise. Let's get kids moving more. This will solve the problem. And you cannot exercise your way to health if your diet is really bad, and that's the thing. So the industry is not only maybe sponsoring research, but also redirecting the debate and then promoting certain ideas. For example, calorie is a calorie is a calorie. It really doesn't matter what you eat as long as you have the number of calories, which is obviously not true because certain foods mess with your hormones like insulin, and then it has whole chain of reactions and so on. So yeah, some of the myths are also promoted by the industry because they serve its interest.
Okay. Now, do you see, apart from the inherent bias of scientists to publish and the sponsoring of scientific research by the industry, do you see other reasons that can lead us to mistrust science?
Yes. One is the inertia of the big institutions, like what they claimed in the 70s, they want to keep on claiming despite of the evidence being the opposite right now. That's one thing. But the other thing I wanted to say, I forgot, just had an idea, but I got into this. Could you repeat the question maybe?
Yeah, so if there are other ways that could lead science to be biased.
Oh yeah, the media, because how science gets reported, it's another thing, right? The scientific paper might be, I don't know, 12 pages, but the media has just one little article and they need a shocking headline. So they will say meat causes cancer, even if the real evidence was, if you have a rat who already has a cancer, and if you isolate this compound that's also in meat, but you add it 10,000 times and then you give it to the rat, then it will, I don't know, the cancer will grow 20% faster. And then like, if you look at it, it's nonsense. Like that, the article suggests that if you eat a little bit of meat being a human, then meat has also a lot of other, compounds that might interact with each other in whatever ways, that this will cause cancer or something like that. So yeah, I think media is not a good source of learning about science. And we need to look at a lot of different studies, especially the independent studies, look at all ways that people see the issue, and then find our own truth, whatever we agree with, and know that we are making decisions with huge uncertainty, and not buy into the fact that, oh, science says it, so it must be the truth. Actually, we are still very uncertain about just about anything that science claims.
Okay. I would say another reason why we, in some cases, might mistrust science, apart from the industry sponsoring science, apart from the inherent scientific bias, apart from the inertia in the institution, as you mentioned, is that political correctness, is that sometimes certain scientific results are not requested by society because they're politically incorrect. And if you do research in that and you come up with certain results that would suggest a certain thing which is politically incorrect, and you have the audacity to publish those results, then you're likely to be banned from any further publishing and you're probably going to lose your professorship at a university.
Yes. And then I think the big issue that's connected to all of that is how medicine currently is all about selling you drugs. Like whatever the issue is, like this is the drug. And it used to be like in the 40s, for example, people were recovering from diabetes with the diet, epilepsy was with ketogenic diet, then they were using salt, for example, if you have a sore throat, gargle with water with salt. They were using iodine to sterilize different things and so on. So they were using very simple, free, cheap ways that actually work. And there was research about that. And
But
now
but is it related to political correctness or what?
no, it's related to the whole subject, right?
Okay.
That basically now there is a bias that every visit to the doctor has to be followed by a visit in the pharmacy so that you buy the drugs, even if you don't need any drugs. Because if you think about it, most cases when you go to the doctor, two things. You either have something that will pass in the next 5 days by itself, it's like a cold, food poisoning, whatever, or it's a lifestyle disease that would require you to change your lifestyle to eat healthy diet, for example, and exercise to get rid of that disease, be it obesity, diabetes, maybe hypertension, all kinds of things, right? So, but you would not need drugs in any of those cases, but they will always give you drugs and will always be only about drugs, and they will not look at your lifestyle, and they will not tell you to use free ways to help you with, like using salt or like using some exercise or like using whatever. That's free.
Yeah, wouldn't you say that that's just the industry, pharmaceutical industry trying to influence scientific results?
Yes.
Okay, so
The
I was
whole culture.
okay. So I just want to repeat. So we have the inherent bias of scientists, because they are always incentivized to publish. If they publish incorrectly, they don't have the cost. If they do publish, then of course they have a lot of benefit. So they have sometimes incentive to publish something even if it's incorrect. Second, maybe most important, is the industry financing of science and scientific research. And the industry, of course, will continue financing the researchers as long as they produce results that are good for the industry. And we can see that in the telecommunication industry, that the telecommunication companies are financing research that generally comes to the conclusion that mobile radiation is not bad for us, even though a lot of independent studies find that it's very bad for us. We can see this with the food manufacturers that are making studies that sugar is not bad for us, even though many times independently we can prove that it is bad for us. Or we can see it with the drug companies that are coming up with more and more diseases, financing research of psychiatrists coming up with more and more diseases, which all can be cured by newly developed drugs, by the pharmaceutical companies. And of course, many times people are better off not taking these drugs. Then we mentioned that there is an inertia of the institutions. Once knowledge comes out, there's a certain bias towards the existing knowledge, and new knowledge is not going to be promoted. Then we talked about the media, that the media, many times when certain results come out that are unbelievable, then they will not question these results, but they will, with sensational journalism, push these results, and these are the results that would then be popularized and many times simplified, incorrectly simplified. Then what I was saying is that there is also political correctness in academic institutions. And that means that you cannot publish results that would lead to a politically incorrect conclusion. For example, politically correct is that all genders, meaning all races and all sexual orientations, are all equal, and there is no difference. So if I were to find a difference in, let's say, intelligence between male or female, or between different races, and I publish this, which many people have done, they get thrown out of university. And the scientists would say, no, but look at the results. I mean, it's clear. The result is clear. But the institution would say, no, this result might be clear, but we don't believe it. We don't want this research. This research has to go away. So political incorrectness is another reason why I
this
feel.
this Yeah, this touches the ethics of research in general, right? Like right now, the standards for research are such that a lot of the experiments that we know from the past, like Milgram experiment and Stanford prison experiment, could not be conducted because they're unethical. So what we feel that is ethical now is different, and we don't necessarily want research that will be basis for example, hating other people or looking down at other people, whole groups of people, because looking down at whole groups of people led to things like Holocaust and so on. So this I can see kind of this dilemma with the ethics versus the freedom of research. But another very interesting point is that now, okay, all the research pretty much comes from the US. Everyone just copies and pastes and uses the findings from the US, right? Like the whole world, the rest. But there's this hidden science, there's this forgotten science, which is the science that was done mostly in Germany in the 30s up to 40s. Germany was the #1 science hub in the world at the time. And then there was the science in Soviet Union, like you mentioned, and those findings cannot be found on internet easily. Whereas those studies might have been more genuine because they were not industry funded to the degree that now they are. And maybe they found a lot of interesting things that are, how to use cheap or free things to cure your disease or whatever. But we are not finding about that because that's either in Russian or it was like before the war and it's forgotten and,
Okay. So what about religion? Do you think religious beliefs influence science?
That's a good one. I mean,
do you believe in evolution?
Sure.
Okay, but I think probably in the US, about 50% don't believe in evolution.
Yeah. That's
because it goes kind of against the Bible.
It's crazy because, like in Europe, despite of the fact that some countries are also religious, like it's a universally accepted fact. Like in Poland, I don't think many people question evolution. I haven't heard. So US is very specific in that, and it's very interesting how that happens. But I think it also happens because in the US there's this loneliness and the ties in families and communities are not as good, and there's no tradition and religion, and like I don't know. In Europe, people were in the same place for many centuries together, whereas to the US, every culture came from different way, whatever, and now they're all kind of not as interconnected, and that's why they need the place to come together and to belong, and that's what religion gives them, but it gives them a lot of crazy ideas on top of that. So maybe that's how it works.
That might be. I also do think that it has to do again with money, in the same way that science is being biased by industry funding. I think that religion is big business in the US. I mean, there are billions to be made. Many churches are making billions. And one of the best ways to become a multimillionaire in the US is not to become an entrepreneur, it's just to become pastor and make your own church.
Mm-hmm.
And you get all these donations and you don't have to account for those donations. You just can just pocket them.
True.
And no accountability for those donations. And of course, then you only get this money if you preach well and you preach the Bible. So you have all incentive to make people believe that it's all about evolution, and the Bible can be taken literally, because then you might be able to get more money.
Because there are a lot of scientific theories, and religion is fixated on opposing evolution, and other theories not so much. Why? Because evolution is saying that there is no soul, basically. Because if there were animals and they don't have a soul, and now there are humans, then what? At some point, let's say 2 monkeys had a baby, and the 2 monkeys didn't have a soul, but the babies out of the sudden had a soul. That doesn't make sense, right? So if evolution is right, there is no soul that religion would want us to believe in. Therefore, yeah, it's really questioning the very basis and foundations of religion, and that's why they're fighting this particular theory or scientific understanding the most, because they're not fighting gravity, for example, but evolution, yeah, it gets them.
Okay. All right. So what else is there? What do we talk about? Can you maybe do a summary?
Well, I think we talked about the fact that for a variety of reasons, from funding to personal egos of the scientists through all the methods of manipulating the data and so on, we should not trust science as much as we do potentially, and we should recognize that science doesn't know that much, and what it knows is not easily generalizable to everyone in the world. And there are differences between genders and ages and regions and genetics connected with that. So even if something is true in the US, it might be not true in Europe and so on. So basically, let's not blindly believe that just because there is an article that science claims XYZ or the study claims XYZ, that this is so. Let's just see all the shades of gray and trust more in your own intuition and your own research, and maybe also do experiments yourself. Like if there are different diets, for example, you might follow certain diets and see how you feel, and then maybe even measure some of the things in your blood if you're interested in that. So the responsibility is not on the scientists, and it's not on the institutions. Like they're failing miserably in providing high quality science. So the responsibility is on us, what we do. So we cannot outsource responsibility for those decisions to other people. We have to look skeptically at all of that and make our own minds and make our own decisions.
Okay. So the conclusion that I draw from our discussion is similar to what you say. I would add, science generally is good. The scientific method is good. However, the scientific method is being questioned, and I would say in some cases unreasonably questioned. And the reason why people question it, what I would say unjustifiably, is one, because of religion, two, because of social media, and especially nowadays, social media has a very big influence where people are believing an influencer just as much as they believe a scientist. And via social media, these things then are spreading virally, even though there is no scientific basis for them. But on the other hand, you are right. There is some justifiable way to be skeptical about science in some instances. And so what we mentioned is, one, there is some inherent bias in science because the scientist needs to publish in order to be promoted, in order to get funding, in order to become famous. He needs to publish. And if it's incorrect, there's no big loss for him. But if he doesn't publish because he keeps finding results that are not so exciting, then he doesn't publish, and then he doesn't get more funding. The other reason we mentioned is that the industry is sponsoring research, and actually a large amount of research is being sponsored or co-sponsored by the industry. And that kind of research we could expect to find results that are not going against the industry. And of course, the industry is financing research that is related to itself. So the telecommunication industry is financing research on the harmful effect of mobile radiation, and it's not finding any evidence. And the food manufacturers are sponsoring research on the harmful effect of the processed food, and they don't find any evidence for that. And we can go on. And the drug manufacturers, the pharmaceutical companies, are sponsoring research for different kinds of diseases that would need different kinds of drugs. And they find a lot of diseases. And then they find that these drugs can cure these diseases. So it's the industry that should make us skeptical about the findings of those industry-sponsored results. Then we looked at another reason being the inertia of institutions. Once a certain knowledge is accepted, it's new knowledge that goes against it is going to be challenged. Then you said media is important. So media means that the media would take a certain result from scientific research and then simplify it, make it larger than it really is, and then people get from that research a different understanding than what the research really said. And then what I said is political correctness, that in some instances, science cannot go that far as to come to results that would not be politically acceptable. And if a scientist does find these results, he cannot publish these results. And if he does publish it, then he will see the political consequences of that. So
Yes.
so we found reasons why people don't accept science, I would say in many cases unjustifiably. But we also found reasons why the scientific results that gets presented to us as true science many times should be taken with caution.